Welcome to Cultimatum, the podcast that delves deep into the culture of complexities of cults and human trafficking. I'm your host, Anonymous Andrew. Each week, we explore different facets of cult life and human trafficking, from the psychological manipulation to the brave stories of those who have escaped.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melody. I'm Andrew's co-host. Having experienced the depth of a cult firsthand, specifically the House of Yahweh, I'm here as an advocate for fellow survivors. My journey has inspired me to help others who find themselves in similar situations. This podcast is committed to respecting our guests' privacy. To ensure their comfort and safety, we offer them the option to remain anonymous.
Additionally, we would like to include a disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Cultimatum or its affiliates. Cultimatum is not responsible and does not verify for accuracy any of the information shared by our hosts and guests. The content discussed on this podcast is based on personal experiences, opinions, and speculation, and should not be construed as professional services or advice. Neither the host nor the guest are assuming liability for any misuse or reliance on the information presented. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and listeners are encouraged to conduct their own research and seek professional advice where appropriate.
Before we dive into today's episode, we want to issue a trigger warning. Some episodes may explore explicit and potentially disturbing topics such as sexual abuse, rape, human trafficking, suicide, and other sensitive subjects. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Cultimatum, the culture of cults. My name is Anonymous Andrew, and with me is my co-host, Melody. Hi, Melody.
Hi, Andrew. How are you doing today?
I am doing... Every time you ask me that,
You just laugh.
I just... Because if I really... Never mind. So, today we're doing... Today we're... Thank you. I needed that laugh. We're doing something different. We've been promising the audience this since like the first month that we've been doing our podcast. We're doing something a little different tonight. We're doing something called the Cult Anatomy: Unmasking, Control, Manipulation, and Brainwashing. Basically, we're going to tell the audience, and you and I are going to comment and tell the audience what really makes a cult. What makes a cult tick? What's the difference between a cult and a non-cult, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And this is what we came up with. So sit back and enjoy. This is about 30 minutes long. This podcast will peel back the layers of high control groups and expose how cults, manipulative organizations, and even movements that don't look like cults take a hold of people's minds and lives. Today, we're exploring a topic that hits closer to home than most realize: how cults operate not just within the religion, but within everyday systems like something called the multi-level marketing scheme, and spiritual communities, and even wellness practices like yoga and meditation.
That's right, Andrew. First, I know that we haven't really covered the MLM cults as much on the show, so I want to give our audience a little bit more information. A really good example of an MLM cult would be NXIVM, and the leader of NXIVM is Keith Raniere. Keith was convicted and sentenced to 120 years for sexual exploitation of a child, sex trafficking women, and conspiracy to commit forced labor. If you want information on Keith Raniere and the NXIVM cult, I highly recommend watching the documentary called The Vow, which is available on the HBO platform. It is also actually available on Amazon if you buy it by the season or the episode. And I can't say enough about how good this docuseries is. So I just wanted to give that as an example because we haven't really covered the MLM portion of cults. But I'm going to get back on track here because this episode is going to go beyond the traditional image of a cult. We're going to talk about how cult Cult-like manipulation can slip into unexpected places such as yoga classes and MLMs that promise financial freedom, or wellness retreats that preach personal transformation. But we're also going to examine the more familiar territory of religious and spiritual cults as well. By the end of this episode, you'll be able to recognize the signs of high control groups, and we're going to arm you with critical thinking tools that you can use to help navigate any potential red flags. And now we're going to give some examples of some red flags. I'm going to start with an example of using episode number 6, where our guest Mandy, who was an ex-member of the Potter's House, they were recruiting by knocking on her door and calling her during a time when she had been through a breakup. And for a teenager, that's a big deal. And they were just relentlessly coming and knocking at her door. And it was a red flag, but both her and her mother misinterpreted this as concern and really did not see it as a red flag until after the fact and looking back in hindsight. And that's an example of one of our episodes that we had a red flag. And Andrew's going to give another example.
Yeah, another example would be an episode we did with Kim Peirano. Kim Peirano's story, which was episode number 28, she explained that early on in the training that had a whole section dedicated to explaining how they aren't a cult, which is a big red flag, as they probably are. So when a cult says to you when you join an organization, we're not a cult, that's a red flag.
Yes.
And so there were also other red flags. She was taking these courses or seminars, and they were like levels. So level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. And when you got up to level 5, I believe you were not or no longer allowed to talk to anybody under level 5, or you couldn't talk to them about level 5. I don't remember which. And each level that you progressed, and it goes all the way up to 10, it got harder and harder. And so there's that control, who you can talk to and what you can say. And,
Yes.
and of course, that's a cult in it. That's what cults do. So, all right, now Melody and I broke this episode down into parts. So we're going to go into part 1. So basically, we just explained what the outline of a cult is.
Right.
Part 1 is defining what a cult is, beyond the stereotypes. Let's kick things off with the question, what exactly is a cult? Melody, most people hear the word cult and they think of religious zealots, isolated compounds, or wild-eyed leaders making outrageous claims, but that's only scratching the surface, right?
Absolutely. While there's often the image that we have of a charismatic religious leader, secretive organizations, a cult can be much broader. It can be a political, a commercial, a spiritual, or a religious group. Cults don't always look exactly like we expect. If we think about groups where there's extreme control over behavior, thoughts, and emotion, you might find that some of the modern day groups we interact with, such as the MLMs or the New Age wellness movement, can have these exact same characteristics. And of course, the religious and spiritual cults can be some of the most powerful and a lot of times some of the most damaging as well.
And of course, we can mention, you already mentioned NXIVM, but you have, I don't know if this was a cult, and this might fall more into the category of human trafficking, but and we're recording this on September 18th, and I forgot, I didn't mention this to Melody, but everybody knows Sean P. Diddy. I think that's his name, the rapper from the 90s. Yes. He was arrested in New York this week, and he is facing life in prison for human trafficking. So maybe one day we'll do a human trafficking expose on that. But there are other cults like the Scientology, the Mormons. There's so many. So cults can operate anywhere people gather around a common ideology, whether it's religious belief, spiritual awakening, or something more benign, seeming like achieving a financial success through an MLM or improving your well-being through a spiritual guide. What's dangerous is the control these groups begin to assert, slowly but surely, over their members.
And religious cults are particularly effective at this. When people are seeking spiritual meaning, they're vulnerable to leaders who claim to have all the answers. It's not just about extreme visible control either. Some of the most insidious groups exert their influence in very subtle ways, making it much harder to recognize the dangers. And I'm going to use an example that I've used before in interviews and stuff, to where being in a cult is a lot like being a frog in boiling water. And it seems very benign in the beginning, and you feel like you're safe until the water starts to get hotter and hotter. And by the time you realize that you're in a pot that's about to boil, it's very difficult to get out. And it happens slowly. You just don't recognize that it's dangerous. And by the time you do, you've now got to figure out how you're going to work your way out of a very difficult situation. And you can hear more about my specific cult story in episode number 2.
Melody, I am so thankful that you explained what the frog in boiling water analogy was, because for 25 episodes you've been using that, and I had no idea what you meant by that. But now I understand. The frog is in the boiling water, and he doesn't realize it's boiling until it gets too hot,
Right.
and by then
it starts out cold. The water's cold, and the frog just sits there. He thinks he's safe. Exactly.
And then by the time it's boiling, he's probably half dead and can't jump out. I get
exactly.
All right. Okay.
Yes.
One of the episodes we did was with Ari Sherwood. And she's another perfect example of a situation that goes beyond the stereotype of a typical cult. Ari's story is far from the run-of-the-mill cult story. You can find more about Ari's story by listening to episodes 8 and number 15. All right, let's move on to part 2, the playbook of cult control. And this is one of my favorite parts about covering the cults. The playbook of cult control, they use something called the BITE model, B-I-T-E. To understand how cults and cult-like organizations exert control, we turn to something called the BITE model, which was created by Stephen Hassan, who is a well-known cult expert. He is also a cult survivor. It's a great tool for recognizing the tactics of high control groups.
Yes, BITE model stands for B for behavior, I for information, T for thought, and E for emotional control. And these are the 4 main areas in which cults and cult-like groups tend to manipulate their followers. Let's go ahead and dive into each one of these.
Let's start with the behavior control. Cults often dictate where you live, what you wear, even what you eat or drink. But this doesn't just apply to traditional cults. In MLMs, for example, they may not control where you live, but they do control how you spend your time. Your day is expected to revolve around recruiting new members or attending opportunity meetings. It's all the same thing.
And I did forget to mention this in the beginning, so I'm going to throw this in here now. For anybody who might not know what an MLM is, another term for that, for certainly the older generation, would be pyramid scheme. So I'm just going to throw that out there, because that is a more, I think, versatile term, or a more common term for older people like me and Andrew. So I'm just going to throw that in
and
there.
it's also, and the pyramid scheme is also affiliated with the financial world, because that's how they scam people out of money. But yes, it can absolutely be contributed to cults.
Yes. The MLM culture is a great example of this. But if we think about religious or spiritual cults, behavior control can be more extreme and evident. Leaders often enforce strict rules around dress, gender role, sexual conduct, or even communication with non-members. The control of everyday life becomes a tool to keep members dependent on the cult leaders for guidance.
Talk about my favorite subject, TFU. Twin Flames Universe. They're using the behavior control to assign gender roles to members. More on TFU is in episodes 22 and 23, and our interview with Danielle about her experience with the group. And I am going to take 2 seconds here and just give my 2 cents. So I have this, what's the right word? I'm
Obsession.
not, yeah, that's exactly the word I was looking for. Thank you. I have this obsession with the Twin Flames universe in many ways, but more with the leaders. It's what they're doing is, we live in America, and it's the land of opportunity, yada yada. And anybody can, like us. We started a podcast, and it's something, you can be an entrepreneur, and if you have something you want to sell, I listen to these infomercials in the morning only because I have the news on, and they have this silly cream you put under your eyes and it makes the bags go away. And I hear it. I've been hearing this for years and years and years, and it's just in my opinion, it's a scam. They're trying to sell you something that you have to pay. Once they get your credit card, they send you it every month, and you have to pay, I don't know, $39.95 a month. And it's one of those things that's almost impossible to cancel. But the TFU do the same thing. They bait you in, and they get you to pay for these videos, which are supposed to teach you how to manifest and attract your twin flame, i.e., soulmate, i.e., partner. And the way the videos are constructed, I would say, is it's like almost double talk. There's never any information in them. So you want to buy the next one, and you want to buy the next one. And, we've heard stories that people are spending upwards of $8,000. And my problem with TFU is the leader. I'm going to leave his wife out for now, because while she's a willing participant, she might be just holding on to Jeff because he's a gravy train. But Jeff is, I every time I go into a TFU rant, I have to be careful. Just be careful of TFU, folks. If anybody out there is even considering going to their website, just be forewarned. And I'll talk more about TFU on my podcast. Absolutely. And watch the documentaries on Netflix and Amazon. Yes. Yeah, and there's plenty of groups on Facebook. Yes. TFU. There's 2 that we belong to, and there's probably, I think there's a dozen
sure more. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that brings us to information control. Cults control the flow of information to their followers, whether it's religious or a spiritual group or an MLM. Leaders often paint anything critical as negativity or as coming from people who don't understand the mission. This limits access to outside perspectives, keeping members loyal.
In religious and spiritual cults, this often takes the form of demonizing outside information, claiming that worldly sources, news, or teachings outside of the group are corrupt or evil. Members are told to only trust what comes from within the group, and this creates a dangerous echo chamber where independent thinking starts to shut down. And a personal example for me is shortly before leaving my cult, my dad was actually told by one of the leaders in the group that he should not be reading his own Bible, but rather he should be reading the House of Yahweh books and propaganda. They didn't call it propaganda, by the way. They used the word booklets. And that reading the Bible, yes, exactly. Reading the Bible without the direct guidance of the group, that he was leaning on his own understanding, and he was actually sinning by reading the Bible without their guidance, which is insane.
That's just ridiculous. Okay, listen, I'm not a Bible thumper, and I'll never. And I was brought up with the Bible, but I can't remember the last time I picked up a Bible. It was probably at a motel somewhere where I looked in the drawer and there it was. I have my own opinions on that, but okay, I'm going to shut up. Another good example would be Kimberly. Kimberly, in episode number 12, she grew up in the Cross Independent Baptist Church, where they were taught that the The reverend had been placed in authority directly from God to his equivalency to questioning God, which is just ridiculous. And thought control is central to how religious cults maintain influence. Cults demand absolute belief in their ideology. In MLMs, for example, you're told to adopt a mindset of unwavering positivity. But in religious cults, this becomes much deeper and more damaging. Followers are often made to feel like questioning or doubting the teachings is a sign of weak faith or spiritual failure.
Yes, this is especially prevalent in groups that claim to have divine authority. Followers might be told that questioning the leader is the same as questioning God, or that doubts are temptations from an evil force. The control of thought is absolute, leaving no room for critical thinking. We recommend here that if you want to go listen to episode number 26 with our interview with Eleanor Skelton. She was an ex-IFB member, and she was told by her parents and her pastor that she needed to switch colleges and start attending Bob Jones University because they said she was starting to have too much influence and exposure from the outside world in her current school that she was at. So that's a good example of them trying to control that.
TFU, you sure you want me to talk about TFU?
Thought control.
All right,
I was giving you some freedom here, Andrew.
Yeah, I be careful when you do that.
No.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about what the Twin Flames does with thought control to encourage members to stalk their twin flame. So there has been many documented legal cases where what I'll just say the leaders of Twin Flames, after 3, 6, 9 months, when people are paying $2,000, $4,000, whatever dollars, and they're not finding their twin flames. Remember, many of these people in the twin flames who join are lonely. They're vulnerable. They just came out of a heartbreaking relationship, and these are the people that TFU preys on. So,
and a lot of times after 6 months, ex is their twin flame. So somebody that broke up with them has already told them, no, I don't think we should be together. And then they're encouraged to chase after somebody who's actually broke up with them, which that's what ends up getting these people with stalking charges.
Yeah. So either they're stalking their ex, or they find somebody that they either find attractive in cases, again, I'll not name the leader, but the leaders will but they'll say, well, Joe over there or Jane over there is your twin flame. And he was very careful how he worded how he wanted them to go after them, but of course he never used the word stalk. We got to make that very clear. He never said stalk, but he encouraged members to go after their twin flame in almost any means possible, and this got many people in trouble. There were restraining orders. Danielle was a perfect example. She I go back and listen to the episode, but she was arrested for stalking somebody who had no idea who she was, and he had no idea that she was in the twin flames, and that's the whole idea of him encouraging people to stalk their twin flame. Episode number 14 with Alana McKenzie, we dive deep into the dangers of TFU concepts and teachings. And finally, we're going into emotional control. Cults manipulate followers' emotions through guilt, fear, or excessive praise, keeping them locked in a cycle of dependence. Religious and spiritual cults are masters at using guilt, whether it's not living up to the group standards or fearing punishment in the afterlife.
Exactly. It's often a roller coaster of love bombing, where members are showered with praise when they conform and guilt and fear when they step out of line. Religious cults may also use fear as fear of damnation or exile from the group as a way to keep members emotionally tied into the system. Both Lucia and Corinne are great examples of this kind of emotional control. They were both ex-members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were both guilted into returning to the church after they had children of their own. They had their parents telling them that they were now responsible for the salvation of their children, and it was their duty to raise them with the beliefs of the organization. You can find more on their stories in episodes 19 and 24.
Another example of emotional control would be Judith Castillo's story. Judith is an ex-member of a Mexican-based church called La Luz del Mundo, and its official name is La Iglesia de Luz del Mundo, which in English means the Church of the Light of the World. She suffered years of emotional blackmail with the promise of being accepted back into the fold of the group. She was made to feel that she needed to atone for the sin she committed. She was forced to wear a scarlet letter of sorts, forced to remain single for years after she was coerced and manipulated into committing adultery by her then husband, who wanted to create a religious, legitimate reason to divorce her and push her aside. And if you want to hear more about Judith's story, you can find her full interview on episode 20. And she was also on my podcast, which we did transfer over. So there's a couple of episodes on Judith you can go listen to. Let's go on to part 3. How MLMs and religious cults mirror each other. Let's zoom in on MLMs for a minute because they're a classic example of modern-day cult-like structure. Melody, you've talked before much about the MLM model is essentially built to resemble a pyramid, with the majority of people working tirelessly at the bottom and only a tiny few making serious money at the top.
That's right. MLMs lure people in with a promise of financial independence, flexible hours, and the dream of being your own boss. But the reality is that the system is set up so that most people will fail. What's disturbing is how these companies use cult-like tactics in order to keep people invested in the group.
And religious cults do something similar, especially when they promise salvation or spiritual fulfillment but deliver control and fear. Both systems prey on hope and twist it into something that benefits only a few at the top. If you listen to Natalie Wong's story on episode 30, titled "A Cult with No Name," one of my favorite episodes, Natalie was asked to continue working for free in a cult in Africa. She would have no way to pay for even her most basic needs.
Another example of this, Andrew, would be Nick Johnson's episode where he was putting long hours in of free labor as a security guard for the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ. That, along with also being punished for not participating in church raffles. You can listen to Nick's episode or story on episode number 21. Now we're going to dive into part 4, which is spiritual and religious cults, control in the name of faith. Let's talk about religious and spiritual cults more deeply because they can be some of the most emotionally and psychologically damaging. Many of them start with the promise of spiritual healing or a closer connection with that God. But over time, the leader takes on more and more control, often claiming to be a divine figure or the sole path to salvation. I'm going to refer again to my own personal story where my leader originally claimed to be one of the 2 witnesses spoken of in Revelations. But before his death, the members started transcribing his sermons into a book, and they started basically teaching that his words were divine as if it was part of the Bible itself. And now, after his death, they look at him as if he is some sort of saint or Messiah.
One of the most dangerous aspects of these groups is the way they exploit people's desires for spiritual truth. Members are encouraged to cut ties with anyone who isn't part of the group, isolate themselves, and place their full trust in the leader's teaching.
In these environments, questioning is not allowed. Any dissent is seen as spiritual weakness or even as rebellion against God. The group then creates an intense us versus them mentality where the outside world is seen as evil and the leader becomes the ultimate source of truth. This is how these cults maintain such strong emotional control over their members.
At the end of the day, cult-like manipulation can exist in so many forms, whether it's a religious group, an MLM, or even a yoga class. It's important to be aware of these red flags.
Absolutely. And remember, questioning something isn't negative. It's actually healthy. Keep your eyes open. Trust your own instincts. Never be afraid to walk away from something that feels controlling, no matter how harmless it can seem at first. So we want to thank all of you for joining us, for listening. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email us. We'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. And as always, we thank you for tuning in to Cultimatum. Your support is always greatly appreciated. If you could just take a moment to rate and review our podcast on platforms such as Apple and Spotify. You can also give us a review on Apple. We would appreciate that. And Spotify, you can now also leave comments at the end of each individual episode. And don't forget to follow, share, and keep listening to all of our latest episodes.
And before we wrap it up, a couple things I want to mention: that we finally have some reviews. We have 5 reviews now. You can only see 2 of them, but because Apple Podcasts and Canadian, even though we're on in Canada, they separate that. But more importantly, Melody and I, besides doing this expose on cults and explaining what a cult is, we are going to be introducing something very new, and within a couple of weeks, you're going to hear more of them. So there are countless documentaries on cults. They're on virtually every streaming platform. So Amazon, Netflix, Hulu, HBO, and Melody, you could probably name 5 more.
Yes.
Yes. What we're doing, we're going through them, looking for cult shows, and we're watching them, and then we're going to comment on them or do like a reaction video, or each of us will give us what we thought about that particular documentary, what it portrayed, how did it portray it the way we, as our podcast, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to be watching documentaries and reviewing. I guess basically we're going to be reviewing them. If you
it's filled with a lot of our opinions.
Oh, you're going to hear a lot. Also, if everything you just heard that we just talked about, if you're in an organization or thinking about joining an organization and you don't know or you don't understand some of the stuff we just talked about, please feel free to email us by just saying, "Hey, I belong to an organization and they're behaving this way, but I don't really think they're a cult." Ask us. We'll be more than happy to help you, free of charge, of course. If you have so this leads into the next one. If you have a cult or human trafficking experience you'd like to share with us, please feel free to contact us at cultimatumpodcast@gmail.com.
And ex-cult members looking for any additional support can also consider joining the Cult Escape and Recovery group on Facebook.
And if you're interested in hearing more from me, you can find me on my other podcast, Anonymous Andrew: Life and the Choices We Make.
And as always, stay safe, stay informed, and remember, you're not alone.